Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's Enterprise Connect webinar, Why You Need to Add Dial Tone, aka Direct Routing, to Microsoft Teams, sponsored by Ribbon Communications and broadcast by Informa. I'm Eric Kraft with Enterprise Connect, and I'll be your moderator today. We have just a few announcements before we begin. This webinar is designed to be interactive. The dock of widgets at the bottom of your screen will allow you to learn about today's speakers, download resources, share this webinar via social media outlets, and participate in the Q&A session that takes place at the end of our presentation. The slides will advance automatically throughout the event. You may also download a copy of the slides via the Resources widget. For the end of our webinar, we will ask you to complete our survey found on the right-hand side of your screen. Please take a minute to fill this out before leaving us today, as your feedback will provide us with valuable information on how we can improve future events. Lastly, if you are experiencing any technical problems, please click the Help widget found at the bottom of your screen or type your issue into the Q&A area, and we will be glad to offer one-on-one assistance. So now on to the presentations. Again, we've got the session, Why You Need to Add Dial Tone, aka Direct Routing to Microsoft Teams. And our speakers are Kevin Keeler, co-founder of Enable UC, and Greg Zweig, Director of Solutions Marketing at Ribbon Communications. Gentlemen, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Eric. This is Kevin Keeler, and let's get into it. You know, Microsoft Teams has experienced phenomenal growth. There's a chart on the left-hand side. You can see just looking from January 19th up until this was April of this year, where there was 75 million daily active users. And in fact, while it's not published, there's certainly some rumors and suggestions that it's actually closer to 100 million daily active users right now. So certainly organizations and end users are finding Microsoft Teams to be meeting, their communication and collaboration needs. What's in some ways fueling that growth is a whole host of new and announced features. So if we look at, for example, in the video space, Teams started with kind of the modest 2x2 video, then it became 3x3. Certainly, as we move through the pandemic and COVID times, Zoom had 49 people, so 7x7. So now Teams kind of has upped that, as well as just recently introducing dynamic views, which allows people to have better control when you've got a bunch of people, as well as content being shared. And then, an interesting together mode that takes people and puts them on a common background. So, Microsoft is investing in the R&D as well as the features. Similarly, in the meeting size, things started with 250 people, then 300, then 1,000, and now you can have 1,000 interactive participants, as well as you can have 20,000 people in a view-only mode, if you're doing a town hall or an all-in company meeting. They've, recently added things like video features and live reactions, so you can comment, chat bubbles to show who's speaking when you have larger meetings. And then things, like live captions, so that using artificial intelligence shows you, a transcript, and they recently announced that now it has speaker attribution, so you see the name of the person speaking, and that's both in the live as well as the recorded. So, the growth and the new features is certainly meaning that a vast number of people and organizations are moving to using Teams. And at the same time, as I mentioned, we all know that the world has changed. And so COVID-19 has probably been the single force that's really accelerated digital transformations. And while, we all were forced to work from home, those of us who were fortunate enough to be able to continue to work from home, there's been many, many surveys that show that this isn't, just kind of a blip. Distributed work will continue. Here's a recent study that was done by Microsoft. And, what it comes down to is that in this case, 71% of managers and employees expressed that they want to continue to have the flexibility to work from home even after there's, a vaccine or there's the opportunity to go back into the office. And certainly, 82%, so, more than 4 out of 5 of managers expect to have more flexible policies. And, I've worked with many large organizations, and it turns out that, people, when they want to go into the office, for the most part, if you drill down, they're actually looking to go into the office, not so much to do work, but rather to collaborate from more of a social perspective. So when people say they want to go into the office one day a week, really they want to go in when their friends and colleagues are in the office. So certainly, the fact that Teams is evolving and the world has changed, those two things coming together means that for many, many organizations, Microsoft Teams is something that should definitely be considered as becoming your phone system. The reason for this is if you're already invested in the Microsoft ecosystem, having less moving parts. So, there's no reason that for many organizations, Teams can't step up and become your phone system. On the right-hand side, there's all the telephone features that Teams delivers. Microsoft went through a checklist of what they believed were the most important enterprise phone features. And, over the past several years, they just checked them all off. So all of the regular features that you would expect can be delivered by Microsoft Teams. Now, that's not saying it's the right choice for every organization, but if it is something that is potentially, meets the needs of your organization, well, what does it take to make Microsoft Teams your phone system? There's really 4 things, and I just want to go through each of these. So first, you need the appropriate licenses. Once again, I'll drill down on all of these. Then you need, once you have the licenses, you need to have some way to connect to the PSTN or the public switch telephone network. That's so you can place and receive calls to what I'll call normal phones. Then you obviously need to do some configuration. And while not strictly required, certainly having ongoing monitoring and analytics is required if you want it to continue to work. So let's take a look at each of those. Licensing is a bit of a black art, and so what I want to do is just give you an idea of some of the different licenses. There's lots of permutations and combinations, especially as a large organization. Please work with your licensing expert because there are a lot of choices. But so you need a Microsoft Teams license. The easiest is, Microsoft, like a lot of vendors, as we moved into this, pandemic, offered a whole series of increasingly powerful free licenses. There was always some Microsoft Teams free licenses, but they added capabilities to that. So certainly that's one choice. Then there's, a whole level of subscriptions for smaller organizations: Business Basic, Business Standard, Business Premium. Then there's the Enterprise series, so the E1, E3, E5, and I've shown the suggested list price. It's $8, $20, and $35 per user per month. Large organizations can negotiate, of course. This is list price. And then there's also a series of license for what Microsoft calls first-line workers, the F series, and or frontline workers. And there's other ones that I haven't listed, so licensing is complex. So you obviously have to be able to run Teams. And then you can choose. That allows you to have peer-to-peer calls. You can, inside your organization, have meetings, have video calls. But then if you want to allow an external party to be able to participate in, for example, dial into a conference, you need an audio conferencing add-on. That's list price of $4 per user per month. But if you have an E5, which is kind of the highest level of licensing, that's already included. So if you have an E1 or an E3, you need to add that. Now that doesn't really, that's not making Teams be your phone system. It is allowing people to be able to dial in. So somebody that's in their car and wants to add, join a meeting, there is, dial-in numbers internationally. So most of the time, in most places, they can dial in without incurring any long-distance charges. But what you need to be able to have Teams be your phone system is this additional phone system license. That's an additional $8 per user per month. Once again, unless you have the E5, because then that phone system license is included. And then if you need to have an ability to, so you've got the right licenses, but then you need to be able to, connect to the PSTN. And one of the options is to have Microsoft provide that connection. And then you can choose to get a calling plan from Microsoft. There's two flavors, one that gives you domestic calling at an additional $12 per user per month, gives you a pooled 3,000 minutes per user. That's a lot of minutes you're never going to go over, especially because it's pooled. Or with international, it's $24 per user per month, and you get 3,000 domestic minutes per user pooled, as well as 600 international minutes. So, step number one is you need the appropriate licensing. Now, step number two is you need a connection to the PSTN. Greg's going to talk in more detail about direct routing. So there's two choices. You can either have Microsoft act as your carrier and provide that connection. That makes a lot of sense for smaller organizations, and it makes a lot of sense if you're a larger organization and you want to kind of dip your toe in the water and pilot it. It's very easy to set up a Microsoft calling plan and test out Teams, both being able to receive and place calls to the public switch telephone network. Makes less sense financially for many larger organizations and for a variety of different reasons that Greg will drill down into. But so the step number two, to have Teams be your phone system is a connection to the PSTN. Those are the two flavors. The third thing that you need to do is somebody either in your organization or a partner needs to go in and configure the appropriate things like assigning telephone numbers, setting up maybe call queues or auto attendance, controlling how inbound and outbound caller ID, and setting calling policies. Which users can call internationally? Do you block calls to, toll 1-900 numbers? So this takes a little bit of expertise, but the key message that I want to share is all of this, Microsoft has done a pretty good job, and it's an evolving job like the other features of creating, a menu-based system, relatively straightforward screens to follow. So you need to then, take and configure the users that you want to be able to use this. That's the third step. And the fourth thing is, once again, while this is maybe optional and some people don't think about it until afterwards, I would argue that you should be thinking about it from the beginning, which is, so when Teams becomes your phone system, how are you going to ensure that you're delivering quality, reliability, monitoring and tracking usage and adoption, and certainly capturing and reacting to user satisfaction, doing those things, putting in place somebody who understands how to interpret and monitor those things is really what you need to ensure long-term success. So you can look at perhaps people that aren't using certain of your phone features and maybe some additional training, or maybe there's some technical issues. Once again, Here's on this slide is a number of different reports that are available from the Microsoft Teams Admin Center. And while it takes a little while to get used to it, there's a wealth of knowledge and a wealth of built-in reports that Microsoft has provided out of the box. And if you find these were to be insufficient, there's some also third-party reporting that's also available. So those are the four steps to get you check off those four things: licensing, the connection to the PSTN, the configuration, ongoing monitoring analytics, and you have Microsoft Teams as your phone system. But I talked about that there was really two different ways to connect to the PSTN, and direct routing is the second way, and many large organizations, for a variety of reasons, have additional complexity that makes direct routing be a more appropriate choice. And thankfully, we have Greg from Ribbon, who's an expert in direct routing. And I'm going to turn it over to you now, Greg, so you can step us through some of the considerations around direct routing. So over to you, Greg.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Can you hear me okay? So anyhow, thanks, Kevin. I think it's important for folks to kind of start at the beginning, in the sense that oftentimes when we start discussing direct routing, people are a little bit confused just by the basic term, and I think it's our job in telecom every few years to take the same terms and give them new names. In this case, when you think about direct routing, basically what you're thinking about is a SIP trunk or a concurrent session or a concurrent voice path between you and the PSTN, AT&T, Verizon, Bell, whoever that might be. And so one of the first questions that sort of comes up is, well, how do I determine how many call paths I need? Well, the good news is that most people already have some sort of a PBX or the communication system in place. And basically, in order to determine that, you're basically going to look at what you have today and typically emulate it. There are some general rules of thumb. It's not uncommon for people to use something like a 10-to-1 ratio. So for every 10 users that you might have on Teams, you would need one SIP trunk or one direct routing connection. And then in terms of how you set up direct routing, there's basically two choices. You can go with an on-premises model, what we show on the left, or a cloud-based direct routing model. Now, the on-premises model is probably the one that most people think of because traditionally we've had PBXs, in our business or inside our location. So we typically think of, hey, I have a connection between me and my service provider, again, AT&T or Bell or whoever, and that comes down into my business, and then it goes into my PBX. So the natural inclination is to say, I'm going to replicate that. I'm going to bring the PSTN service into the premises and now just connect it out to Teams. And that's still a very much viable option. There's a couple of good reasons to do it. One being you may already have a Microsoft Certified Session Border Controller, which is part of the call flow, and you want to reuse that. So in that case, that's an excellent rationale. You may also be in a position where you say, hey, I still have an existing PBX. I have a contact center in this environment. I'm not going to make a complete jump to the cloud, so I'd like to be able to manage both of those concurrently. That's another reason you might choose to do that. Conversely, if you're in a position where you say, hey, look, I'm going to go all in on Teams, I want to maybe I've got legacy equipment that I want to get rid of in the premises, or whatever the scenario might be, I'm moving and I want to go completely cloud-based. There is the option basically to deploy the SBC concurrently in the cloud. You can use something like you can deploy the SBC right in Azure. You could deploy it in AWS. You can buy it as part of a service model, right? So any of those scenarios will work, and obviously there's some nice advantages to that if you choose to go in that direction, because you get the benefit of the fact that the session border controller and all the assets are cloud-based. It's very low latency. You're not putting yourself in the middle of sort of the call path. So if somebody were to, in theory, to dig up the connection to your office, that you would somehow be, impacted by that. One of the other big questions we get, though, fundamentally, is why do I need a certified SBC in this whole solution anyways? Well, I guess the obvious answer to that is because Microsoft requires a certified SBC to support direct routing. But to be fair, you shouldn't be doing it just because you have to. There's a big part of the reason why Microsoft decided to put a session border controller in this call flow is because I think fundamentally they recognize that any IP connection into any network has the potential to be a point of ingress or egress for a bad actor. And voice is no different. Now, traditionally, I think when most of us think of voice security or even VoIP security, we think of things like toll fraud. But more and more, we have to start changing the way we think, because the reality is that voice connection is just another door into your network, and it needs to be just as secure. And one of the examples I like to talk about is the fact that just a few months ago in San Francisco, they found that Russian hackers had hacked into the construction website for the airport. Now, you kind of look and say, well, why the construction website? Russian hackers probably are not trying to gain an advantage on paving contracts. But what the Russian hackers were really looking for were passwords, credentials, because they recognize that what happens in this kind of environment. Well, there's contractors who do lots of different jobs at the airport, and those contractors probably use the same password for multiple systems in the airport. And by gaining access in one place, they recognize they can gain access in another. And so the whole idea, behind the session border controller is not just to prevent that traditional voice security, but to also secure the rest of the network. So if somebody tries to use this as a point of ingress or egress, it's locked down. In addition to that, the SBC also provides some very voice-centric services, things like session control, so it can manage things like if you get a large influx of calls, it can make sure that those are handled in an orderly manner, or there's some sort of a overload condition. It can offer redundancy and high availability options, so you can have things like lifeline services if you were to lose connectivity. It handles media services. One thing that people don't often recognize is that Teams uses two excellent codecs for high-definition audio, G722 as well as Silk. However, most PSTN providers, service providers, use 711 or 729. That's typical. So as a result of that, the SBC in many cases has to transcode down to one of those codecs to go in and out of Teams. And then also, one of the things to recognize is even though SIP is supposed to be an industry standard, there are nuances associated with it. And as such, you do need to sometimes turn a few knobs in order to get interconnection between the various service providers, because not every environment is exactly the same. And then last but not least, the SBC can be a critical piece of an enhanced 911 scenario. So it supports something called ELIN, which is Emergency Location ID Number. So if you have a scenario where you have people in large buildings and you need to be able to essentially use a sophisticated way to be able to determine where they might be in, say, a multi-story building, the SBC can actually go in and replace the user's typical telephone number with an alternative number that essentially defines their current location, and it can interoperate with Teams to use some of Teams' 911 services in order to make that into sort of a complete E911 solution. Now, another big question that we often hear is, well, what's the best way? I have to acquire this SBC as part of my direct routing solution. What's the best deployment option? And the reality is, there's really no right or wrong decision. It's as much a financial consideration as it is a technical one, in the sense that really it's about how you want to acquire and where you need the security services. So do you want a CapEx model like traditional hardware or virtualized software, or do you want an OpEx model, something like an as-a-service model? And it also may depend on sort of where you want to terminate the dial tone. So we talked earlier about the fact if you have a scenario where you have an existing PBX, maybe you have a large number of analog extensions or elevator phones or other things where you need to be able to continue to support those, and you need a solution to be able to terminate dial tone in the premises. Well, in that case, you may look for something like hardware or virtualized software. Obviously, in the case of hardware, you can buy session border controllers that include things like T1 ports. So if you want to connect in a contact center or something of that nature, you have built-in gateway solutions. Right? Conversely, you may be in a situation where you're trying very hard, and many companies are, to move all of the hardware and software out of their premises, in which case a cloud instance or as-a-service model works best for you. As I said, really, it's really as much a financial as a technical decision. What you're going to find, at least I can speak from our own SBCs, is that the software is either identical or virtually identical between all of those models. So you're going to get the same functionality and features. It just depends on the model that's most appropriate for you. And I think people labor over this decision to a great extent. I'm not saying it's not important, but I don't think that it's as critical as perhaps some people make it out to be. It's really, as I said, a financial decision. And we also, and Kevin touched on this a little bit earlier, but we also get a lot of questions about what do I do if I want to stay connected to an existing device. I think it's really important to understand that there are a lot of tools out there, the session border controller, and as well as VARs and SIs from an expertise perspective can help. So if you're in a position where you may only want, on day one, you may have a large Cisco or Avaya implementation, for instance, but you're trying to figure out how do I get my top 100 people to have integration with Teams. There are tools out there that we and others make that will make that possible. If you have a scenario where you need to, you may have hundreds or thousands of analog devices, a variety of things. People forget fax. We'd all like to probably forget about fax, but it's an important scenario for a lot of customers. There are tools available to enable you to interconnect those things and make them part of the Teams ecosystem. So whether you're in a situation where you want to go all in, or you want to have initially a hybrid model, or you want to get to a sort of a hybrid model with a strong scenario where I want to move to Teams over 18 months, all of those are viable options. So there's definitely ways to make that happen and make it happen in a rational model. And of course, from our perspective, we are very focused in this marketplace. Ribbon has been involved with Microsoft for over a decade now. And, our SBCs are widely deployed in the world's leading service providers, whether it's an AT&T or Verizon or BT or Bandwidth or IntelliPeer. There's a good chance, actually, that if you acquire one of our session border controllers for your Teams environment, that you'll actually be connecting to one of our session border controllers on the service provider side. And we leverage a lot of that knowledge to build extremely scalable, highly available solutions. So you can get one of our solutions for as few as one session all the way up to 150,000 sessions with high availability. And you can buy it as hardware, you can get it as software, you can get it as a native app in Azure or AWS, or you can buy it as a service. From our perspective, again, that's a financial decision that fits into your environment. And then beyond all of that, and again, Kevin touched on this, we believe that security in this environment is more than just buying a box or a virtual box. It's also about all the analytics and the proactive security steps you can take. So we've worked very hard to integrate these elements into a larger security framework so that as you move forward and the sophistication in your environment changes, you can leverage these tools to continue to secure your network. We deliver it all through skilled partners, and of course we have our own professional services, and we leverage the value of our SIs and VARs to deliver even more. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Eric and see if we have some questions.
We have quite a few questions and more coming in. So let me jump in. Great presentations, really timely topic. I want to pick up on that point about 911 that you were making, Greg, and maybe bring both of you into this. Someone's asking specifically, you mentioned, Greg, kind of about the, giving a little more location information. That's something the SBC can do. Does that the question is about with direct routing, sort of fundamentally, how do you deal with devices that are off premise? You've now got this world where everything's remote access. Is there a way, if you're using direct routing, how do you think about E911 for a very distributed workforce?
Kevin, you want me to start with that one, or?
Yeah, go. You start, Greg,
Okay.
and then I'll add some color commentary if needed.
All right, sounds good. So I'm going to have to start with the sort of applicable statement that you should always consult your local rules and regulations, because what I'm going to talk about is sort of generally speaking, and I think particularly if someone's here from the U.S., it's a state-by-state set of rules that apply. But basically, I think this is a very important point, because it is true that, traditionally we're used to the idea that, hey, you could say if somebody picked up the phone, extension 1001, you knew that phone was in Bob Smith's office, and so therefore you had a defined location for that. I think I give Microsoft some credit, though. I think they've done a pretty good job of creating a series of policies that essentially allow them to understand subnets as well as wireless access points, and essentially map those to something they call location information services. And so basically what happens is you can define inside of Teams a set of policies on a per user and a per site basis. And that, if memory serves me, I think the site basis takes precedent. But basically, when someone calls 911, Teams can look at the information that's available to it and make a decision on where it believes that person is. And if it can't make a decision on where they are, it also applies a more generic policy. And if that policy doesn't apply, it actually won't let someone dial 911. So, and as I mentioned earlier, the ribbon SBCs can be a part of that whole calling process.
Yeah, so yeah, that's a good explanation. What I would add is this is certainly an area where, the devil's in the details, and it's absolutely, a health and safety issue. So as Greg said, the rules are sometimes changing and a little bit convoluted in different areas, certainly throughout the U.S., and then internationally it gets even more complicated if you're dealing with a multinational. And I think organizations need to then, have somebody who understands the limitations, because, for example, even something like, if you have Teams and the power goes out, probably your network goes out, and then, in your operations for your organization, what's going to be the approach for people in your organization to be able to contact, emergency responders. So some organizations feel that cell phones work. Some facilities, such as manufacturing, there may not be good cell phone coverage. So people might put in those analog devices that Greg talked about, being able to connect to an SBC, or just even a simple kind of carrier line in certain locations to deal with the, lack of power. So a complicated and important area. I think, the organization has to decide first and foremost, what their approach is, and then the technology can be brought in to kind of hopefully match up with those requirements.
And
Okay.
Just one last thing to add, because I'm kind of reading through the questions here as I'm going, is that if you use Google and if you type in Microsoft Teams and E911, you'll find that Microsoft has done a really good job. They have several documents online that you can reference, it might take you 2 or 3 reads to sort of grasp all of the nuances, but they do have a very detailed set of docs around their 911 support.
And there is a question about the new carries law. Do either of you have any thoughts on particularly relating to maybe how you would be deploying in a direct routing scenario, whether you'd have to change from maybe how you would have done it before carries law was passed?
I believe, that generally speaking, the big issues around carries law, obviously the first one is you can't put a preceding 9 in before 911, and so that's kind of I think well understood. There are some rules, and Microsoft Teams manages these around the fact that you in a large environment you need to be able to alert multiple local people as well as the external 911 entity, or in your area, if there's someone listening from outside the U.S., it might be a 999 or something of that nature. But those tools do exist inside of Teams to enable that from a carries law perspective. And then I would say that any service provider that you deal with today, anywhere in North America, is going to have a carries law compliant offer by law.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's been my experience as well. I mean, I think that some of that prefix code was kind of more the legacy system where you had to dial some number to get out. That was less so in the Microsoft ecosystem, or when it was implemented in terms of the number normalization, it was done really to make people be able to do what they used to do, right? So, but to Greg's point, there are solutions across pretty much every geography to address that.
Okay. We have a couple of questions about stir and shaken, a couple of protocols. One asks for Cloud Direct Connect, who and the possibilities being Microsoft Ribbon or the PSTN carrier handles stir and shaken, and then somebody else asking essentially the same thing, can Teams support that? So if maybe for those of us who aren't up on stir and shaken, if Kevin or Greg, you could maybe give us just a quick reminder of what that is, and then who in this scenario of direct routing handles that.
Kevin, you want to start?
I can provide. Yeah, I'll start. Just so stir shaken. I mean, it's really, and I'm going to start at kind of like the business problem that's addressing. It's intended to be some protocols that help combat spoofing of caller ID. So while you can overwrite caller ID numbers and you can pretend, and that's important because, for example, many organizations, they'll dial out and they don't, they have contact center agents and they don't want, the individual DID number, the individual number associated with that contact center agent to be the number that shows up on your phone. They want to have their organizational number. So effectively, they overwrite the caller ID.
I think we maybe either lost Kevin or
I think perhaps maybe the hackers got him. But I think what Kevin was getting at was basically that sort of fundamentally most of the stir shaken environment is managed by the service provider, and this is something that a lot of Ribbon's business is focused on providing service providers core hardware. So we're familiar with a lot of this, and it kind of ties back to this idea of authentication or of the user. In other words, making sure that whoever places that call is who they say they are. And so that's the primary focus of stir shaken. Now there are some nuances, or maybe nuance is the wrong term, but there are some items or pieces of stir shaken that a business can participate in terms of trying to make authenticate who callers are as they come in. But I think that's I don't think that there's anything in Teams that necessarily precludes you as an enterprise from leveraging those, and we could have a whole another conversation on that. But fundamentally, 90% of stir shaking is really focused on how carriers deliver calls to businesses so that they're valid.
Okay, and I don't know if we've got Kevin back. I know we've been trying to. Kevin, do you have anything to add
back.
on? So I don't know where you lost the thread.
Yeah, I'll move on to the next correct question. Okay.
Well, let me ask kind of generally about if you're doing cloud-based direct routing. I don't know if you want to name specific service providers, but is that something that most any service provider will support, or what do you have to do as far as finding the right provider for that?
Well, there's certainly a large number that do. I won't say that everyone does. I think that's probably the best thing to do is reach out to your sales contact at that, or the 800 number at your existing provider and ask that question. But there are a lot of significant number of providers worldwide, for that matter, that do that. And certainly, again, a quick Google and you'll probably see more names than you ever care to who are involved in that environment. And we know that from firsthand experience, because obviously we support a lot of those deployments. Most of the major players, I think, you can think of from a brand perspective, have an offer.
Is there a way to think about that, Kevin? Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, different providers, in my experience, have different pricing plans, and so there's some financial aspect around that. And, as well, like if you have, a SIP provider that's being used and, for a legacy phone system, and then if you're converting over, you may have a multi-year contract, and that's outside of the technical reasons you might want to use direct routing, on premises. It may very well be, or in the carrier's cloud, it may very well be because you have a multi-year contract and it's easier financially to transition by doing that. So I think, what Greg said is certainly talk to your initial, your current provider, because that's probably the easiest transition. But there's certainly many different providers with different price points and different value propositions.
Got it. Okay. We have a question. I maybe direct this to Greg, kind of for maybe a ribbon specific perspective, but then Kevin, maybe what you've seen with deployments generally. They're asking, they don't kind of give a specific scenario or application, but they're asking, will SBC, if you go in the cloud with SBC, will that support what they describe as heavy transcoding, again, without specifically saying what?
No, that's a great question.
Or is it better to go on site with dedicated hardware for that?
Really, traditionally, I think the answer has always been dedicated hardware, and the reason being that you get, we have, these huge DSP farms that are part of large SBCs. But, over the last couple of years, what you'll see is, particularly in the cloud native type environments, you can leverage the processing power that's there, and you can get a pretty significant amount of transcoding from the cloud. Now, there may be a break-even point there where in some environments it's still more cost-effective because of the sheer volume of transcoding. The hardware actually may be less expensive than buying the compute power in the cloud, but there's no technical reason why you can't go one direction or the other now. This is like almost all media types in the cloud now. There's excellent resources available, high availability, high compute power resources that you can use to do transcoding.
Is there maybe, and Kevin, just to bring Kevin in, is there maybe also, Kevin, either some kind of a DR scenario or something where you might do a hybrid or a combination?
Yeah, well, I was going to say that, I think most of the time what drives in the cloud or on-prem is some of the other attributes that Greg talked about. So, it's as he said. I mean, you can kind of get the compute power where you need it, but it's often, the need to connect to some other, on-prem equipment. Like that's what's driving, your choice to be on premises. Or as you say, there are specific DR scenarios where an organization philosophically decides that they would like to have, an SBC on premises, or vice versa, an organization that just really wants to be cloud only makes the other decision, right? So I think it's not so much the compute power right now that's kind of choosing which fork on the road you go down.
It's whether it's that specific thing that's causing the heavy transcoding or potentially just the broader picture of your network.
Yeah, that's been my experience.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
I've got some kind of specific, more or less yes or no questions that I'll toss out. Does Teams offer call recording, both automatic and ad hoc?
So the answer is ad hoc, yes. That's, and then automatic, that's going to be more of a third-party solution based on my understanding of the question.
And then does direct routing only support TLS-based connection between on-site SBCs and Office 365?
Yes.
All right. Greg, we have a question about what Ribbon can provide in terms of the call analytics. I think, Kevin, at the end of your presentation, you kind of mentioned, what you can do now with analytics. And I've seen, just in our company's implementation of analytics, it's starting to tell me that I'm doing too much messaging in the middle of the night or something, and it's kind of amazing. Is the analytics and how an enterprise should think about getting those and making them kind of meaningful? Does that reside just with Teams, or what does Ribbon do to kind of supplement that?
Well, so a couple things. One to consider is the fact that in many cases, right, just because someone has rolled out a Teams environment, they may still have a traditional, say, contact center environment or cloud-based contact center environment for that matter. So one of the things that we can do with analytics is roll together a broader view and also roll together multiple sites, depending on how, if you have a large multi-environment situation. And then not only can we actually deliver the analytics, but one of the things that a big push is really, can we deliver actionable analytics? So, it's one thing to tell somebody the horse has left the barn. It's another thing is, can you close the barn door before the horse leaves? And so from a security perspective, what we're trying to do is recognize threats, and they may come in from different vectors and different places on the network. As we see those kinds of threats, we can actually go out and proactively tell the other assets in the network to react to that. Or we can tell the manager of the environment, hey, we see this threat and we recommend you do X. Right? So in our mind, it's not just presenting information in the past tense, but it's about how do you deliver information that people can do something with to solve immediate problems.
Yeah, and I would just, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, I'd just add on to what Greg said, is that certainly, Microsoft Office 365 provides a whole bunch of analytics. So that's much broader than Teams. So the fact that you're sending messages, that might be because whether you're sending chat messages or email, Office 365 will tell you that. And what, the Ribbon and the SBC, is very much complementary. So it has visibility much more detailed in terms of like the SIP trunk, so it can actually report, from kind of out to the carrier side, which teams can't see, and things like channel usage on the SIP trunk. You can kind of derive some of that through some of the team stuff, but it's a lot of heavy lifting. And, Ribbon has direct access to additional complementary information. So I think, the rich teams plus the Office 365 analytics augmented by, the SBC analytics, that gives you the fullest picture. And then that gives you, as Greg said, that gives you the best chance of having some actionable analytics in a timely manner.
Greg, we have a question about Ribbon's licensing model with direct routing support. Is it part of your standard SIP session licenses, or does it need to be procured separately?
No, this is one of the things I think that creates so much confusion is the term direct routing. It's really, in our mind, it's a SIP session. So if it's the same session that you would use if you had a SIP trunk today, if you own a Cisco PBX and you have one of our SBCs deployed, and you're using that to go out to AT&T and Verizon, and you're paying for that SIP session today, that's the same SIP session. You're just using it for Teams instead.
All right. Here's a question, and maybe I'll throw this to Kevin as the Teams expert. Is there anything like a receptionist console available for Teams? Certain says they've not been able to find one.
Yeah, so the answer is yes, but it depends on, I guess it would depend on specifically what you're trying to do with it, but I'll figure out who asked the question, and I can send some links of, places they may want to check into.
Yeah, I do know that MIDA, I think, who's one of our partners, has a small contact center and receptionist console that works with Teams. MIDA. Somebody wants software, not hardware.
Right.
Okay. Do either of you know, does Direct Connect use machine learning or AI to provide like proactive insights, or kind of what's the status of that kind of next generation analytics as you look at things like fraud prevention and service robustness?
So when you said Direct Connect, Eric, do you think they meant does direct routing or?
Direct. You're right. I'm going to say yes, direct routing.
Okay, so I'll speak to the kind of the broader Microsoft analytics. Like certainly, Microsoft for their piece, is certainly using a whole bunch of machine learning and AI to try to to improve their analytics across the Office 365 suite. But the direct routing piece is going to reside with kind of the SBC. So Ribbon, Greg, over to you to answer that question.
Yes, machine learning is a big piece of the puzzle, and it's one of the reasons why you want to have something that's you want to use those analytics from a cloud type service where it can actually process together information from multiple sources and look at it sort of holistically as opposed to just on one asset in one place in the network. And as with everything else, a year from now, the answer will be more than whatever it is today from that perspective, because everybody is moving in that direction for everything. Eric, you're going to get 2 emails next year.
Even better. I can't get enough. I don't know if Microsoft has announced this or given any projection, but someone's asking, and I think this is more just maybe a general Teams question because it may be a constraint nowadays. What's the time frame when Teams will support 1,000 meeting participants?
Yeah, I would have to. So you certainly can do 1,000 non-interactive, right? So you can do, a live meeting, so a town hall or whatever. The 1,000 was just introduced with some of what they were talking, just announced kind of last week or the beginning of this week. I don't know. All the days blend together in the pandemic, but it just in the last week. And then it becomes complicated because it depends what tenant you're in. So like we run in tenants that are in that are released sooner. But all of those features, they said were going to be available. My recollection is this summer. So I think you're a month or two likely away from the 1,000 users, interactive users in a meeting.
Okay. Here's a situation that a person has that they want to ask about. They're thinking about adding just one site to Teams phones and keep the other 4 on their legacy PBX. Can they cancel one PRI and replace that with Teams phones while they keep everything else connected to their legacy?
So this sounds like a perfect example for when you would want to use an SBC, depending, from what I understand from the question. So the answer should be absolutely, and you can, the numbers that are on the PRI need to go somewhere, and so they, you could port them to Microsoft as a carrier, or you could keep the PRI and, kind of either you've got a SIP trunk as well, or, so Greg, there's lots of options that a ribbon SBC would support. So I think the broad answer, as I understand the question, would be yes, but why don't you add to that?
Well, I think, the devil's in the details, as you said earlier. So I think the general answer is yes. I think that the challenge for anyone in this kind of environment is to find a systems integrator or VAR who can help you with that. Because what you do need to get right is, to your point, you're going to have to talk to the service provider and get the numbers moved off of that PRI and into some sort of a SIP trunk. And you're going to have to figure out the dialing plan so that all of these people can continue to work together and not break that somehow by making the migration. So I think this is less about the pure technical answer of yes, and more about making sure you do it in a way that makes your internal and external customers happy with how you've deployed it. But I don't think there's any limitation, but I do think you need to be attentive to how it's all going to work together, particularly if, as an example, you have 4 Avayas that are all networked together today and you want to remove one and put Teams in the middle, because there may be some proprietary networking that was put in place when that was originally deployed. So those are the kinds of things you need to be, attentive to, so that you don't make people unhappy when you make a change, because it is certainly possible to do it.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have. It's been really great to have all these questions from everybody. We're glad to have gotten them, and we're glad to have been able to get to so many of them. So appreciate Kevin and Greg, taking the time, and I don't think there was anything we threw at you guys that you couldn't handle. So I appreciate such a great presentation from these guys. I want to remind everybody also that Kevin's going to be presenting on Monday, August 3rd, as part of the Enterprise Connect virtual event. Ribbon is going to be there as one of our sponsors, so please register for that virtual event at enterpriseconnect.com/virtual and visit the Ribbon space within the virtual event, and you can learn more about this and a lot of the other issues that are really top of mind right now. And of course, here we've got a slide for you with some other resources that you can pick up. So with that, I want to thank Kevin and Greg for a great hour of presentations. For the audience, thank you. We had a terrific turnout and lots of great questions. We appreciate your attention and your participation. Within the next 24 hours, you'll all receive a personalized follow-up email that'll give you the link to the replay on this, and please do share that with anybody that you think might also get something out of the webinar. This webinar is copyright by Informa. Presentation materials are owned by or copyrighted by Enterprise Connect and Ribbon Communications, and the individual speakers are solely responsible for their content and their opinions. So on behalf of Greg and Kevin, I'm Eric Kraft. Thanks for your time and have a great day.